welcome back to the 2016 Exhibit Columbus Symposium, Foundations and Futures, which is presented by the College of Architecture and Planning at Ball State University. I want to thank again Ball State University. They've been video recording all of the sessions today and a couple other things. So will you join me in thanking Ball State for their work today? So I'm really excited about this session. When we talked about this symposium, we said we wanted to bring international leaders and community leaders. And I think this is one that kind of shows that in many cases, there's not a difference. Our community leaders are in many cases international leaders. So I'm really excited to bring up in a minute all the folks for the next session. But this session today is actually presented by the city of Columbus. There are so many people that work for the city that have been extremely kind and generous to us in creating this project, and I want to thank them, from the mayor and everyone at City Hall to the Parks Department. I don't know if you all know this, but this is actually a city park building, so I'm grateful to them. And they even hung banners for us along Washington Street. I don't know if during lunch you all had a chance to see some of the banners. We're really happy with the way everything looks. Will you join me in thanking the city of Columbus for their help? So in this session, we're going to hear from Jeff Brown, Ben Wever, Steve Forster, and Mary Chandler. But first, to introduce the co-chair of this session, you've already heard her a lot today. She is probably the person that I think maybe we should rename the brain trust of Columbus. She's super smart, and I'm proud to introduce her. She's my friend Tricia Gilson from the Columbus, Indiana Architectural Archives. I think maybe she's going to come up with the entire group. Yes, great. And so I'll allow Tricia then to introduce the group, but as she's coming up, I'll tell you a little bit about Tricia. She is the archivist and curator at the Columbus, Indiana Architectural Archives, and prior to coming to Columbus, she was assistant professor of anthropology at Ball State University, where she taught cultural anthropology and museum studies. She has worked at the IMA as the archives and content specialist for the digitization of the Miller House and Garden collection. She worked at the Getty Research Institute. I could go on and on. Welcome, Tricia. Thanks for bringing so many great folks with you.
Great. Thanks, Richard. And thank you all for coming. The title of today's session, of this afternoon session, is Making and Maintaining. And this morning we had talks from various historians and journalists trying to provide some of the historical context for Columbus's design heritage. And the purpose of this afternoon's panel is to really get a local view of what it takes to make these buildings and to maintain the buildings. And so I'm very excited about having Ben Wever with the Indianapolis Museum of Art, Jeff Brown, who's with Travel Indiana, but his family is associated with the Republic newspaper here in town, Steve Forster from the Bartholomew Consolidated School Corporation, and Mary Chandler with the Cummins Foundation. So first up, actually, we're going to talk with Jeff Brown, because it seems like, Jeff, your slides have loaded first. It's a little change up in the order here. So as I said, Jeff is with Travel Indiana. He is the president of it, and it's a media company that is devoted to the tourism of Indiana's tourism industry. The Brown family came to Columbus almost 150 years ago, and really at that time started what would become Columbus's newspaper called the Republic. His family's been associated with journalism both in Columbus and the region, and his great-grandfather, I think it was Isaac Brown, is that right? Right. Started what would become the Republic in 1872. Jeff was the CEO of Home News Enterprise, the Republic's parent company, for 17 years. And Columbus, for those of you who don't know, has 7 National Historic Landmarks. And the Republic Building, which is just right down the street here at the end of Washington, is one of those National Historic Landmarks. It was designed by Myron Goldsmith, and it was completed in 1971. And it is a project that the design, building, and construction of it was spearheaded by Jeff's father, Robert Brown. I invited Jeff to participate today because the story about the Republic building and his family, I think, really broadens our understanding about architectural patronage in Columbus. When I first started coming down to Columbus to do some work, the story that we always hear is the story of the very, very important role of the Miller family. And then it gets traced out a little bit to talk about the Miller family role with Cummins and then also with Irwin Union Bank. But I think the story about architectural patronage here is much more complex, and I think that the example of the Brown family really helps us understand the complexity of our history. So this is an image of the Republic building, and I wanted to start off today by having Jeff talk a little bit about the first project that your father and Myron Goldsmith worked on, because it was not the Republic, it was another building. And so I wonder if you could talk about that project and also their relationship, their personal relationship.
Sure, thank you. Well, I think before you can understand the projects that my dad did, you kind of have to understand the man. And so let me just briefly get into a couple of things about him. Robert Brown, my father, he was a double E electrical engineer at Purdue University. He was a World War II veteran. He actually took a radar installation. At the time, it was a secret radar installation, and made it mobile so they could take it up on D-Day into France. He was an inventor. He was a problem solver. He loved puzzles. He loved making things more efficient. I mean, these are the things that really were a part of his life. And I remember a time, and it was like late 1950s, and I was born in the late 50s. My father had built a tic-tac-toe machine, a computer, out of pinball machine parts. It was basically a 40-pound piece of 3 foot by 2 foot piece of metal that we could actually go in and play tic-tac-toe on. I mean, he did this from scratch. I mean, he's quite a genius. So after World War II, he comes back to Columbus and goes to work for his father, and that was at the Chamber of Commerce building. That's where the newspaper was. And at the time, newspapers were using hot metal as the way you printed the newspaper was basically a foundry. And it was very labor intensive. It was dangerous, dirty job, but Dad learned it. He learned how to run the press. He really got into the process. He was trying to help his dad make it more efficient. His dad was an engineer also. And so, he was in the process of trying to be a problem solver with that. And in the meantime, he starts going to national associations to learn more about newspapering and to make contacts and things. And at one of the exhibits at I think it was in New York, he sees an exhibit on photolithography, which is offset printing. Seeing this, and newspapers were kind of on the cusp of looking to this new technology to go into, Dad sees this as a prime opportunity to take what we have here and move to a new process that he really wanted to prove. I mean, he was really excited about this technology. So he very much wanted to build a new building. The only way you're going to move to the offset printing technology is to buy a new press, and that requires a new building. So he'd had several discussions with his father, who at the time was running the business, and his dad said, "There's no way we're going to build a new building." And so, Dad kind of went back and forth on that. Finally, there was a point where Dad did start running the business, and he decided this is what we're going to do. So he, through some industry contacts that he made, and I think it was in Chicago, at a press association in Chicago, he finds out about SOM, Skidmore and Merrill in Chicago, and very interested in this firm to do a building here in Columbus. And so he has these discussions with them. and winds up going to Skokie, Illinois, to the library there, which I believe is still there. I Googled it, it's still there, that SOM designed, and I think Dad took a tour to that, and also met Myron Goldsmith at that point in time, and was very much sold on the firm at that point. It sold really on Myron because Myron was a structural engineer, spoke my dad's language. My dad, loved that, and he and Myron could talk about engineering concepts and those types of things. So, very much sold on that. So, and the other thing is, Dad really didn't want to have anything to do with the architects on the Cummins list, and I don't know why that is. I'm sorry. I'm really sorry. But I think he wanted to maintain some control over whatever. I mean, this is what he wanted to do. So I just thought you'd be interested in that. You're not interested in it, okay. So anyway, he starts building. He starts the project with Myron. He's going to build this building down here, and Myron is the structural engineer. He was not a partner at SOM at the time. And so Dad writes his diary. Dad wrote an entry in his diary every day of his life from 35 years old on. So I was able to kind of get in some interesting things. But Dad said in his diary, Myron is very thorough and wants to understand each detail, each and every detail. And so, that could be a negative comment like, oh my gosh, I don't want to, get into this. With Dad, it was the best thing that could happen. I mean, because he was incredibly detailed, and so was Myron. So he gets the cost estimate for this building. They go on through the planning process for about 6 months, and it's $1.4 million, and that's 1960. So it's probably like $8 million today. No way he could pay for that. He couldn't get financing. He's pretty shocked, frankly, but and they could also not get the property that Myron wanted, which is the property where the building sits today, south of the courthouse. So in the meantime, my dad, his father becomes ill. My dad starts running the business, and he decides that he's going to pursue another opportunity, and that's to build a newspaper in Franklin, Indiana, which he had been looking at. So he pulls Myron in, and 1961, and they start working on this newspaper in Franklin, Indiana called the Daily Journal. Yeah, there it is. You can see that pretty similar building to what we have here with regards to the, you don't have the colonnade that you have in this building here, but had a great time designing this with Myron. Dad invented a lot of things for offset printing. This is the first offset printing plant in the country from the ground up for a newspaper. So Dad started this newspaper in Franklin. It had no circulation, no advertising. It was in a competitive situation. He's dealing with brand new technology. So it was quite a project for him, and it turned out to be very successful. So, and I wanted to, there's a quote I found in this Forum magazine. They were talking about Myron Goldsmith in regards to this building. They say, he is a master of his generation and one of the first artist-scientists who have so mastered structure that they can express it intuitively as poets do language. I thought that was quite a quote. So anyway, that's how all that started.
Yeah. So when your father started thinking about a new building here in Columbus, a number of things happened at the same time. So one is your dad is working with Myron Goldsmith for the second time for this building for the Republic. And SOM is hired by the city to work on a master plan for redevelopment. And my understanding is that Goldsmith considered the Republic building as really an anchor of the redevelopment plan. And so I wondered if you could talk a little bit about the role of the newspaper in community life and its importance downtown. I mean, why is it that they decided on this downtown location when we know that there was some discussion for a building outside of the redevelopment zone?
Right, yeah, Dad had originally looked at a building, and I think, yeah, we've got it up on the screen here. You can see it was the location that he was looking at was on 2nd Street, not where the building is now, but it was to the east of town. And Myron was pretty insistent that the building needs to anchor the downtown. It needs to be at the south end of town, aligning along Washington Street. And so Dad had not yet acquired that property, but there was a redevelopment commission in the 60s that was established to start the process of some kind of a downtown revitalization. And Dad was very much of a part of that, but so as Dad decides in 1967 that, you know, the Daily Journal's successful, he wants to move forward with his building in Columbus, so he starts this process, and at the same time this redevelopment's going on, the gentleman that chaired the commission was Ben Bush, and Ben had a chance to meet with Myron as Dad was working on him designing this building down here. And Myron, through these conversations, convinced him that, you know, look, why don't you let me, and why don't you let SOM help with the redevelopment project in addition to this building, because the two are so integral to each other. And the fact that he wanted this building in that lot. And so Ben agreed, and then Myron went one step further and said, well, why don't you let SOM just do the whole redevelopment project and be the lead architect on that. And an agreement was established, and so that's kind of how SOM got involved in it. So they start designing this building. Dad hadn't actually bought the property yet where the building was going to go, but I believe, and I know there's people in the audience here that probably know more about this than I do, but that the redevelopment commission at the time had been able to, the property was condemned, and Dad was able to acquire it kind of into the design process. So that's in essence how that worked. And this slide also shows the other locations for the Republic. We've been in 5 locations. Started actually at the Crump Theater. Some of you may not know that, but the very first weekly newspaper that the Republic put out was at the Crump, so we've been in a variety of different buildings downtown. You know, the newspaper's role in, my dad always saw it as an important role in economic development. I mean, you know, newspapers are the 4th estate, and we all know that. But Dad saw it as an opportunity to really make an impact downtown. He knew it was, you know, obviously he knew what Cummins was doing. He was influenced by that, but he really saw it as a way to help, you know, his own business, but raise the bar in the community for anything else that was downtown. So I mean, it was, you know, we're just really fortunate we were in that situation to be able to do that.
I'm going to jump ahead a little bit and to ask you to talk about when one of the times we met before as we prepared for today, you talked about the importance of the transparency of the building and what that had to do with excellence and the excellence and striving for excellence at the Republic. And so I wonder if you could talk about that high concept of the Republic as being transparent and what that has to do with excellence through architecture.
Well, I think the idea is, the concept idea is that the community can look, the newspaper holds the community accountable. The institutions of the community accountable, our 4th estate role. The community then holds the newspaper accountable. And so it's sort of a two-way, you know, you can see through the glass, the community can see in on the newspaper and see how it's operating, and the newspaper can see out, and there's sort of that give and take back and forth. But really, I think what Dad wanted to do was show off a process that he was really proud of. And you can do it in a glass building. I mean, it was just, newspapers are highly value added. It's an incredible process to take raw material and turn it into something that you're retailing to the customer. And so it was a process he was very excited about. And yeah, you can see it here with the press in the window, which isn't there now. But so, you know, that's pretty much how he thought about it.
And as we close out, could you talk about some of the challenges of having been in that building with that press there for all of us to see. I mean, what did it take to maintain that visibility of the press and this dirty, filthy process of printing?
Well, Goss had never painted a press yellow. Most presses were dark blue, and obviously it's just that you're throwing ink everywhere when you run those presses. So you have to pay a lot of attention to keeping that clean. But it, it was an important central focal point for the building. It was a rotating piece of sculpture, essentially, and that's the way Myron saw it. Honestly, it was a great building to work in. I mean, it made thunderstorms even the more exciting, because there have been times I've been in my office and the glass is vibrating like this, because we got this storm outside. But it's just a very there's a lot of light. I think Dad was trying to accomplish that when you walked into the building and you're being hired there as an employee, that people could see that there was a standard that we wanted to keep, and it elevated that standard for folks that came to work for us. And I know one thing that he used to do is he used to walk in and out of the cubicles, and if anybody had taped anything up to the glass or any of the walls, he would go by and just tear it off like that.
Your dad did? Or
oh, my dad did, yeah, absolutely. Okay. I mean, employees lived in fear of him coming into their cubicle and tearing things up. But, you live in a glass building, and you can see that stuff from the street. And you just, newsrooms at the time were just traditionally difficult places to keep clean. Very creative, but anyway.
Right. Well, thank you, Jeff. I really appreciate you sharing the story of the building and your family's role in building it.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
So we're gonna switch gears. We're gonna talk to Ben Wever. Ben works with the Indianapolis Museum of Art, and he's the site administrator at the Miller House and Garden, another one of our National Historic Landmarks. The Miller House and Garden was commissioned by J. Irwin Miller and Xenia Miller in 1953, and it is the result of this really magical collaboration between Eero Saarinen, Alexander Girard, and Dan Kiley. The house was completed in 1957, and it became a National Historic Landmark in 2000. The family lived in the house from 1957 until Mrs. Miller's death in 2008. Ben began working at the Miller House first as a groundskeeper, and then he became Mr. Miller's personal assistant for a number of years. And so his time at the Miller House, and this is one of the reasons why I was really interested in having Ben talk today, is because he's worked at the Miller House both when it was owned by the Miller family and now that it's owned by the Indianapolis Museum of Art. When the IMA took possession of the house in 2008, Ben was hired on as the site administrator. And in addition to working at the Miller House, he used to work for Ingledow Group, where he oversaw many projects related to Dan Kiley landscapes. And so we're going to be focusing on the landscape at the Miller House. And I think it's safe to say that we can't think of the Miller House without thinking about the garden. And so I've asked Ben to tell us a little bit about who Dan Kiley was and something about what characterizes his landscapes as a way to talk about the difference between his landscapes and some of the others that we have in town. So, Ben.
Thank you, Tricia. I'm going to start out just with a brief explanation of Kiley's work. As many of you know, Dan Kiley was one of the premier modernist landscape architects of our time, and something that is very indicative of many of his designs is monoculture plantings, or what he would call uniculture planting, and that was kind of a term he tagged himself because he felt as if when you would go through the woods or walk through nature, you would oftentimes see several of the same species or something that would be very closely related in groupings in the forest. So as we're looking at this and we think of Kiley as being more of a formal landscape designer, he was trying to also add that aspect of nature of putting these groupings of plants that were similar. So we have a picture here of the allée, the honey locust allée, and this is a prime example of monoculture planting. And then if we switch to the COB, which is a Jack Curtis design, we see many different species of plants planted in one setting. What happens with this is that when you do have one particular plant type or species, you will have the same sort of problems with each plant. So if you're going to have a disease or a pest or something that's going to affect one of these trees, it's more than likely going to affect all of these. So this is one of the main things that you really have to look at while maintaining a Kylie landscape.
Could you talk about some of those challenges of maintaining a Kylie landscape? And I know that since the Miller House and Garden became part of the IMA, you've overseen a couple of different projects related to the landscape.
Yes, I'd like to first start out with the horse chestnut removal. This is a plant choice that Kylie was fond of horse chestnuts himself, but Mr. Miller had grown fond of the horse chestnut from what he had seen through his travels in France and then also while in school at Oxford, and was insistent that this be part of the landscape plan. What we had with this planting, this is a picture of the horse chestnut alley when it's looking at its best. But as we transition through some of these photos, we can see that it had a blight that affected these trees, and many times by the beginning to mid part of June, we would not have any leaves left on the trees. So as we worked with Mr. Miller, we would try our very best to do what we could to maintain these trees and keep them looking good. But during times of heavy rain in spring and different aspects that would kind of counteract the measures that we were trying to put into place to save this, we realized that this just wasn't going to be something that we could maintain. So we had some injections done to these horse chestnuts. I guess the photo isn't included in this, but it shows the scarring and the wear and tear that these trees were taking on as we were trying to take care of the blight year after year. So with a great group of co-workers, and I'll even say mentors, with Mark Zelonis being here, Mark Zelonis, Bradley Brooks, Chad Frainer, and myself discussed options and wondered what we could do to put something else in this location. So we found a yellow buckeye, which is the same genus as the horse chestnut, would be a great replacement because it is native to the Ohio River Valley. And since we've installed these, we've seen a great amount of growth, and they've really taken to this space. But the next challenge, as we see this piece of machinery working on one of the stumps here of the horse chestnut, is that when we have a fixed landscape, when we have something that's already mature, and we're trying to preserve that as best as possible, we have many things to think about. The pavers that are in the Miller House and Garden is a setup that the Millers saw in Switzerland and brought over into to Columbus in the 70s, and it's an integral part of that kind of walk through the landscape there. And so with the curbing and with those pavers and such mature trees, we had to take some extra measures. So we have, the first picture we saw was a grinder trying to remove those roots, and then the next scene we have a backhoe taking these out as gently as possible, because as I said, we already have a mature landscape, and we don't want to cause any more problems than possible. So we took a very delicate approach to removing all these trees and making sure that the pavers and things stayed intact. The next photo is, this is a picture of the yellow buckeyes. This was actually just taken a few days ago, And we've experienced about 5 feet of growth on these yellow buckeyes just in a few years since we've planted them. So this has been a real success. And if we move on to the next photo, every detail is included when we try to do these projects. So the lighting was replaced with something that was a little bit more efficient, environmentally friendly, and there's a shot of those horse chestnuts at night. The next project I'd like to speak of, these are the two biggest projects that we've had concerning the landscape since I've been involved with the museum. And this shows the size of plant that we chose. When we were going to replace the magnolias that surrounded the house, this was a very important design tree on the property. And unfortunately, it is a tree that really isn't planted very often anymore in our nurseries, because they've came up with new varieties that bloom later and take away some of the problems that they generally have with magnolias. But sticking to that original plan and that design intent of Kylie, we were fortunate enough to be able to go to Hulka Nursery in New Jersey and handpick these saucer magnolias. And this really shows the size of the tree that we were able to get. So as we removed the old tree, we were able to bring in almost another specimen tree and not have as much impact on the landscape that way. And there's all 4 of those magnolias after they'd been removed off the truck. And as we proceed through these slides, I'd like to show, again, that the effort that it takes. We've already came in and removed the roots and worked very delicately in these ivy spaces surrounding the house, and then had to add plywood to try to protect that ivy bed as much as possible and the irrigation beneath. And this shows how you have to work so slowly and so carefully to get these trees into place and not disturb any other part of that landscape. And then finally, a picture of the magnolia in the ground, and as we see today, doing very, very well, and again, getting a nice sizable tree in there to replace such an iconic part of the garden.
So one thing that I'm really curious about is you started work at the Miller House and Garden when it was owned by the Miller family, and now it's owned by the Indianapolis Museum of Art. And I wondered if you would talk a little bit about the difference of approach in how you care for and maintain the garden from when it was owned by the Miller family and now that it's part of the IMA.
Okay. Well, when the Millers lived in the residence, of course, we had a larger staff that worked on the property, and we also had a closer connection to Dan Kiley and later Jack Curtis. So we had this interaction between the client and the architect still available to us at that time. We also would be in a position, if something needed to be done, we could take care of that as quickly as possible, as soon as we saw the need for that. Now, we work with a great staff at the museum, but we have to plan strategically and think, 5 years ahead, 10 years ahead, and look at these projects that we know are going to need replaced or need some sort of work, and think of how we can do that with the budget that we now have for the home.
Right, so it used to be that you could do maybe a hurry-up job,
Yes.
and now we're spreading it out. Okay, so I think as we conclude, Kylie did something like 40 projects here in Columbus. Many of them are no longer intact, but Kylie landscapes present a particular challenge, but we also have a number of landscapes by Michael Van Valkenburg and Jack Curtis. And so to broaden this out and think about landscapes more generally instead of just at the Miller House, would you talk about how we as a community can begin to care for some of these landscapes?
Yes, I think the first part that needs to be considered is just an education on what we have in town. So we need an awareness of all the different landscapes that are significant in town. then we need to look at how those interact with those buildings and also interact with the community. As we look at North Christian Church, we've found out that not only is that a beautiful landscape that relates so closely to that Saarinen building, but it is also something that's even used by members of the community that have no affiliation with the church. We've heard, oh, we enjoy walking our dog in that space, the playground is great for the neighbors, and that sort of thing. So we really need to look at the impact that these landscapes have, like I said, not only on the buildings, but as the community as well. And as we're thinking about that, we can also look forward and think, well, now we're in a position where there are new varieties of plants, and there are things that may work better in these spaces. Of course, keeping to the original design intent of Kylie and Curtis and Van Valkenburg and others, but maybe replacing plant material with something that might do a little bit better, or coming up with a newer plan. Because if you look through the archives and look at the Miller House and Garden, changes just were consistently made. When something didn't work, they would figure out what did work, and that would become part of that new design.
Right. Thanks for the plug on the importance of archives. Being able to do research, yes. Right after my heart. So thanks, Ben.
Thank you.
So we're gonna now move on to Steve Forster. Steve is the Director of Facilities and Operations at the Bartholomew Consolidated School Corporation. As Steve likes to joke, he worked for Cummins for 32 years, and then he flunked out, I think, and was sent back to school. So he went from Cummins back into school, and he's been with the school corporation for 12 years. And as the Director of Facilities, we heard from Alexandra Lang this morning about the role of the Cummins Foundation in building our school system. Steve arguably is responsible for the greatest amount of our significant architecture in Columbus. I think both
that's scary, isn't it?
I think both in terms of numbers of buildings, but probably also in terms of square footage. I'm not sure. But I wanted Steve to talk about his first experience when coming to Columbus and not working for the school corporation, but to go back and talk a little bit about your work with Cummins and your introduction to the city and its commitment to design excellence.
I chose this story because we talked about foundations, and we talked about building, and we talked about excellence. So I'm going to paint a story to begin with. I grew up in Columbus, southeast of Columbus, on a farm. I went to school here, and then I went and studied engineering and business. I came back. I was out of money, so I had to come back and get some money, and Cummins was nice enough to hire me for a while to participate in the corporate facilities group. Now, I knew nothing about what you guys all know about, and so one of my first projects was on 301 Washington Street. I'm not sure if they were trying to teach me or get rid of me, but in fact, that was one of my first projects. Now, the fortunate thing is I had some great mentors in corporate facilities. Cummins had a legacy of excellence in facilities, and we, in fact, did have some great people. And I can speak of folks like Tom Harrison and Harold Hatter and Wilbur McDonald and folks of that nature that were there to help and make sure I didn't go astray. The other people that, when we got into 301, was talked about. Bill Chambers was the project manager. And fortunately, we had people like Barb Volz, who happens to be Ben's grandmother, kept me out of trouble because I was inclined to not be as tactful as I should be. So in the process of doing this, I observed, because I was almost like a mouse in the room, and I got to see some really amazing people do some amazing things. Alexander Gerard, they completed design, but they had all these prototypes. I was flat blown away. We had half-scale drawings, and I'd been working in construction before. And so half-scale would be, if you got a desk 5 foot, then the drawing would be 2.5 feet, is what I'm talking about. We had full-scale prototypes over in the A. Tross building of both the office areas and the secretarial areas and any other kind of thing, so all the clients would have an opportunity to feel the design and see what was going on, and so there would be no their expectations would be fulfilled, and they know exactly what was going to happen. Now, the fun part of that was we had another gentleman that worked with Mr. Hatter that's called Stan Emery, and they did these prototypes with great vigor and it's really great detail. When we went to prototype an office, we had the detail of the desk, we had the cantilever, we had a storage unit here, we had a cantilever here of the desk, we had the seat, we had the light, we had the doors, we had the door handles, we had diffusers on the windows, we had all the carpets on the wall, we had everything down in detail, including, and this is, since we're going to be talking about maintenance a little bit, I'd like to talk about, they actually had vacuums throughout that building so it's easier to clean and to operate. So every detail was thought about. And in fact, there were times when Mrs. Miller or Mr. Miller would be there working on that. One example would be on the facade of 301, there is many different colors of the sky connection related to blue. And so they stood on the corner of 5th and Washington and figured out which blue they ought to be working on. So as we were going through the process of both design and construction, because we had Taylor Brothers, I think David's Daups out there, and the Taylor Brothers legacy, Virgil Taylor, very good, skilled people were part of that process. Really good people that cared and really wanted to do a good job. And the end result of that was that I think there was many details in there from a technological standpoint of improvement, both on ventilation systems and how you put the carpet on the walls and how you get the adhesives that had not been thought about before. How do you mend radiuses around the corner of the walls and on the coves, and throughout that building there's just detail after detail that was very finely tuned. That was my experience on learning about the excellence in design and construction was on that job. I was blown away by that. Since that time, I've had many opportunities to help build, to help maintain, to consolidate, demolish, reorder, redo many things, refurbish, and yet I don't think I've ever come across a project that was as detailed with people caring to really do their absolutely utmost to make it as perfect as they could make it. And so that was my indoctrination at Cummins and said, okay, in retrospect, I'm not sure you could have given a young man or a young woman that any more kind of information related to what they ought to be looking for as they're putting together a project. One other item was we're in the preservation. We had an old building that we're trying to make very exact. We had demolition, the calmest demolition that happened. We got bricks that were taken out of the rubbish and put on the east wall. We couldn't figure out how to get some bricks on the south side to match on windows and stuff that we're trying to do, so we looked all over the region and couldn't find any. Mr. Hatter did, and then we just veneered the brick so that in fact it was as close to match as we could. So in talking to Bill Chambers later, he said that the building, because of that detail, was pretty good to maintain. So I'm pleased that even after all those years that was still stayed a good building. Now you want to switch gears?
Yeah. Why don't we talk about the school corporation?
Okay, let's talk about school corporation.
Okay, so talk about the school corporation, something about the students,
Sure.
mission.
Sure.
Give us all the nuts and bolts.
Well, we have 11,650 students, all right? That's why we exist. We are there to help them be successful. And so we are trying to have individualized approaches to help them be successful, and everything we do is to help them. And so in the school, as a building, we're trying to make a learning environment so that the students can be successful. Now, we have 21 buildings. We have about 2,500,000 square foot of space. We have 300 acres of land. This is the greatest job under the sun, mostly because there's people to serve, there's problems to solve, and there's buildings to love. And it is just amazing, some of the complexities and the problem solving and the opportunities are unlimited. I call them UFOs, unlimited facility opportunities. So we in fact, that's good, right? So we are off and running, and going forward, we're the caretaker of 14 buildings that are in fact, that were paid for. Mary's organization, the foundation, paid for. And we have been privileged to have innovation and creativity from many fine architects, and we still have the remnants of very creative solutions to the programs that we've given them. as you can see on our listing of buildings, the red ones are in fact the 14 that had the architectural fees paid by the foundation. So we're very pleased about that, and so it's been fun. I'd like to maybe talk a little bit about how we maintain. What is excellence in maintenance? As we talk about these 14 buildings, or all these 21 buildings, we have, in fact, do the normal thing of the cleaning and operational and the maintenance related to how do you go from reactive and to planned maintenance and preventive maintenance and all the good things around maintenance, predictive, all the good stuff that you can do in maintenance. And we keep pushing the limits because that almost every maintenance organization will say that we're mostly reactive and we're trying to become planned. So that's what we're trying to do. Now, some of our challenges are, we already talked about the complexity of those buildings. We also talked about the numbers. And the other part is, as Ben talked about, we do not have unlimited funding. So the sourcing, our resources are always limited. So we're always trying to figure out what is the best way to spend our money. And in fact, this is the 4th time we've done it, but we're right in the middle of looking at this again. The last time we did this was in 2011. We're trying to get facts, and so we go back and do an assessment of each building. We use CSO Architect has been helping us in that process. And what we have up here is a listing of what we look at during that process. And you can see that we worry about safety and codes and security, and we worry about the educational adequacy of the spaces, if we have what we need from that standpoint, and really look at where we stand from a equipment and efficiency standpoint. So we, in fact, have a grading of each of our buildings. So when it's all said and done, and you can see the grading up here, if it's 1, we're in good shape, it's 4, we're in bad shape. And when we put that all together in a matrix, we can see with especially with the color coding, that the red, yellow, and green, that we are in fact trying to see which one is where we ought to put our money. Now, the last time we did this was in 2011, and in fact, we were able to get about $24 million and without changing our tax rate, which is always crucial to you and to us and everyone else as far as taxation. So we were able to go through those several buildings, almost all of our buildings, and make improvements. What we prioritized on was mostly what would be the effect to the student. How will the student be affected? How can their classroom be improved? How can we have more flexible furniture, more ergonomic furniture, more technology, whatever is required in order to help that student be successful? And then if there's more left, then we would go and tackle any kind of maintenance issues or equipment that is about to die or become more efficient. I'd like to talk to you a little bit about one of the projects that we had, which was McDowell. And obviously that was a National Historic Landmark building that we have, one of the 7 in Columbus, and talk a little bit about that project. We in fact did do the improvements. We had, you can see it's a lovely building, and we heard from Alexandra this morning that the organization of that space is extremely good with the pods around the 4 corners, and then we have support buildings in the middle related to office and bookstores, and then we had a cafeteria and a multi-area gymnasium on the south side. It was a very functional building. It's received some complaints, some of which complaints were around its energy efficiency. The building uses 152,000 BTUs per square foot, which doesn't mean anything to you other than the fact that after the improvement, it went to 78,000 BTUs, so we cut it almost by 50%, which is, again, as we made the improvements, we're trying to also get the operational improvements intact. So we changed out the roof, we changed out the walls, we changed out the ventilation systems, we changed out the finishes, added technology, and when it's all said and done, we went from a score of 128 being very, very high and very, very bad to a score of 67, meaning it's in line with the rest of our buildings. Now we have, at this moment, we're going through that process again, and we were looking at each building, we've gone through an assessment of each building, we have prioritized 41 items related to where they stand related to what we want from a building from a standpoint of best practices and building excellence. And we are going now, at this moment, trying to determine where we should be making those improvements. So this has been a very good process for us to at least quantify and look at our demographics, which is also going on now, and see where do we need extra capacity, where we have buildings that are failing, where we have systems that are failing, and then take care of those hopefully proactively. And as Ben said, we need to plan out further. Given that we had limited resources, we need to always be planning out further. So that's my story, and I'm sticking with it.
I'd like you to keep going with your story.
Which part of it?
In one of our conversations, you talked about, I think you said maintenance is a little bit of an old-fashioned word or an old-fashioned approach. And you talked about instead thinking about stewardship and sustainability. And I'd love to hear more about your ideas and thoughts about stewardship and sustainability, not just for BCSC, but again, thinking about our collection of buildings and resources here in Columbus, and maybe as an alternative way of how we care for our design heritage.
That's a big task. I want to go back to...
You have about 5 minutes.
Oh, okay.
So.
Like we talked about before, designing the universe with one picture, right?
Right.
One thing about McDowell that I'd like to point out, because I'm avoiding this question mostly, but is that while we're getting ready to resurrect this is housing about 1,500 students a day going through McDowell. It is alternate education, it is adult education, and it is, in fact, very well used. And the people that use it have found troubles in a traditional educational process or an environment. So we've had a lot of testimonies of folks who have felt that they were successful because of being in that building versus in a normal school building. I know the pressures and the changes that we're seeing as we go forward, stewardship of the environment, which has always been with us, and we're paying more attention now, thank goodness, and the operational efficiencies and energy efficiencies. I do think that we are stewards of a very valuable resource, that valuable resource being our learning, our buildings that are providing the great learning education environment. So I just think that given some, what we've been doing is trying to hit those singles, just keep at it. We're going to have fewer home runs and fewer Grand Slam home runs, but you just keep looking forward and keep continuously improving. So solving the root causes and doing the normal plan, do, check, improve kind of process and looking forward further is where I think we're going to make hay, because I don't think the resources are necessarily going to be there as much as we'd like to have the resources there. So it's just purely one of tenacity and keep on going down the pike and continuous improvement, in my opinion.
Great, thank you. I'm gonna use the clicker one last time, and I'm gonna pass it down to Mary Chandler. Mary is the Vice President of Corporate Responsibility for Cummins Incorporated, and she is the Chief Executive Officer of the Cummins Foundation. And we heard again from Alexander Lang this morning about the Cummins Foundation Architecture Program, and just now from Steve Forster, the importance of the Cummins Foundation Architecture Program. I think of the program as having really made, as one of the key makers in our community. First by its participation in the local schools by paying for the architect's fees. And I invited Mary today to talk about the foundation and its role in making and maintaining Columbus's design heritage. And I've asked her to start off with talking about the origin of the foundation program, what its mission was, and also I want to know why, and this is a question, I'm a relative newcomer to Columbus. I think I can say it for another 2 weeks when I'll be here for 2 years. Why is a diesel engine manufacturer, why do you care about architecture, and why has there historically been this commitment to design in our community?
Thanks, Tricia. Just for the benefit of the audience, if you're not from Columbus or not familiar with Cummins, Cummins was founded in 1919, and it is in fact a diesel engine manufacturer. The company, the most visionary, I would say, chairman of Cummins was Irwin Miller, who you've heard a lot about, I'm sure, today and will continue to hear about. But I think Mr. Miller recognized from the very beginning of his chairmanship, and certainly in the 1950s, that the success of Cummins was deeply rooted in the strength of the community in which Cummins was located. You know, even today, when you think of engines, you think about a pretty simple mechanical thing. But actually our engines are high technology, top of the line pieces of equipment. And today they use digital technology and electronics. But even back then, in order to maintain your competitive advantage, you had to attract and retain the best and the brightest employees around, and now to us, in the world. You know, Columbus is an incredibly diverse environment, and part of the reason is because Cummins attracts from the biggest cities in the world, Beijing, Sao Paulo, Mumbai, New Delhi, engineers and other talented people from around the world. So I think Mr. Miller saw that back then and was deeply convinced that for the best of Cummins, we had to have a community here in Columbus that was healthy and successful. And what that meant to him back then, and continues to mean to us now, is the obvious things that the gentlemen up here have all spoken about: really good schools. You know, think about where you want your children to go to school. You know, so going to work is one thing, but educating your children is a completely different thing. And most of us would say it's a higher order. So really good schools, safe environment, parks for people to play and walk in, clean air, which is certainly, you know, if you've been to other parts of the world, realize you can't take that for granted. And so he very much believed in healthy communities as an important lever to business success. So, an innovative company, a visionary chairman, and a conviction that they all worked well together. In the 1950s or so, 1954, the United States had come out of the war. The effects of the baby boom were being felt, certainly by Columbus, and the schools in the city were brimming and too full. And so the school corporation, like any corporation would do, began building schools to accommodate this influx of kids. And started to sort of build some pretty quick prefab type schools and structures that were not particularly inspirational. And so Mr. Miller, and the start of the program, to sort of answer your question, was what he came to call unintentional philanthropy. He had a lifelong interest in architecture. He had a belief that architecture is sort of core to who we are, to our memories, to our lives. Think about the house that you grew up in, or your grandmother lived, or the school that you went to for many years. It's very much, for me anyway, a part of my memory, and a part of my love for my community. And so he believed that the built environment and architecture was really integral to the lives that we live. And so at that point, he approached the school corporation and said, hey, what if we gave you a grant to hire a prominent national architect and to build your next school? And they took him up on it, and the first school was built. It was such a successful partnership with the school corporation and the community that they continued down this path incrementally, funding architecture fees for schools. And so that's how the program got started, but it certainly wasn't an intent to build a Mecca or build a huge fund to create Columbus as an architectural destination place. It was very much sort of organic and incremental.
So The program, I mean, the program began with schools, right? And I
Yes.
think that in the late 60s, it begins to expand.
Yes.
And you have a slide a little bit later where it shows some of those. So we get firehouses, the fire stations, and City Hall, and the jail. And so it expands out over time to include different types of public buildings, including in the early 90s, parks, urban development projects or studies, and infrastructure. And I'm curious about that change from being so focused on education and schools to include all of these different building types, and how that fits with the mission of architectural excellence. Is that a shift in mission? Is it an expansion of scope? I mean, why these changes?
When you talk to Will Miller, Irwin's son, and I did not know Mr. Miller. I know Will, and we have all tried to understand the way that the program developed. But they've all been pretty consistent in saying, you know, it was going well, so let's just keep doing it. You know, Mr. Miller would say that his belief in the civil rights movement and the work on civil rights in Columbus was highly intentional,
Right.
very planned, very much a strategy and a belief that was deeply rooted in who he was and who the company was. Not so much the architecture program. It started out, again, with these schools, but because it was going well and the results were really inspiring, and everybody in the community, not everybody, but most people thought this was a great thing for the community, so let's try a park, let's try a bridge. And so it was very much sort of building on the success of the program slowly but surely. And that's where we are today in many ways.
As a community, we're faced with a number of aging modern buildings and the challenges of caring for them. And the architecture program, by paying for these architectural design fees, has, I mean, a really, truly pivotal role in enhancing our community's quality of life. If I started by saying that I thought the architecture program was really one of the prime makers of our community. What role does the program, the architecture program, the Cummins Foundation have in maintaining, and in some of the ways in which these folks have talked about the challenges of maintaining?
Yeah, so I think it's a great question, and you can kind of take it in two different directions. Just in terms of maintaining or keeping up some of these, really important buildings, the architecture program of the Cummins Foundation certainly supports renovation, and we have funded renovations to buildings, where possible, trying to consult with or hire the original architect who understood the vision of the building. Certainly, that is a part of the program. You can also sort of go to the idea of Cummins or the foundation being a maker of these buildings as, is the purpose of the program to create a beautiful building? Or is the purpose of the program to do something else in the community that we believe is important? And I think it's both, actually. The mission of the program is architectural excellence. So, the goal is an architecturally excellent building. At the same time, it's important to understand that Cummins and the foundation views itself only as a facilitator or an enabler, because we only pay, the process is that we only pay the architectural fees for public buildings. And so the idea for the building needs to come from the community, from the public. We provide a list of architects, and then the owner of the building, the public entity, selects the architect and then moves forward without Cummins. We then step back. So we don't design the building. We don't influence the actual design. And we're there to help if the need is there. But really, we're just a facilitator, a partner with the community to create something beautiful in the county.
I'm not sure how to frame this next question. One of the things that I'm very curious about as a relative newcomer to Columbus is thinking about this thing called the Columbus Way. And it's the collaboration between public and private. And with the Foundation's architecture program, I guess I want to understand a little bit more about the distinction between striving for architectural excellence and the process that underpins that. So could you talk about maybe the process versus the product?
Yeah,
I don't know if that.
Yeah, no, I tried to allude to that a little bit with
Yeah.
the last answer, but whether it's the architecture, I mean, obviously Cummins is a Fortune 160 company. We have 50-some thousand employees around the world and 8,000 or 9,000 employees in Columbus, Indiana. The lives and fate of Cummins are inextricably bound up with the lives and the fate of this community, and I think that it is an incredibly successful partnership. We are not the only business in town by a long shot.
Right.
But we are certainly one of the stakeholders in this community. And so, getting back to your question, if, as Jeff said, we weren't interested in the Cummins list of architects,
Right.
which is a great statement of partnership
Right.
and independence and decision. And it's a great way to look at the way we all participate in this community. So the process of the Architecture Fund is, as I said, to put a list out there, and then it's up to the community and the owner of the building to move forward with the project. We like to think of ourselves as, like I said, a facilitator of the process. Mr. Miller had a famous line, and it was interesting to listen to your description of maintenance as an old-fashioned concept, but he had a line, a quote where he said that mediocrity is expensive. And we see it all the time in business. We see it in schools. There are easy decisions and there are hard decisions, and sometimes the easy decisions are the most expensive ones that you can possibly make. I'll never forget one time that we picked up a stray dog. My family did, a little puppy. We weren't looking for a dog, didn't want it. We had 3 young kids. It was crazy around the house. And an accountant walked up our driveway, who's a neighbor of ours, and I said, "Hey, do you want a puppy? It's free." And he said, "There's nothing more expensive than a free puppy." That's right. The point being that if you think that by doing nothing or spending little or not caring or not collaborating, it's less expensive and it's the best way to go, it almost never is. And so I think, coming back to your question, I think the community, Cummins, the government, the citizens all work very hard to make this community one of the most inspiring places in the country. It's truly a beautiful place.
Thank you.
Welcome.
So I'd like to thank everyone for participating. We still have about 15 minutes left. I think everyone is open to some questions. So I'd like to just open it up to people if they have any questions. I think we're going to need to pass the microphone, and I think I'm going to ask Kelly Wilson maybe to be the farrier of the microphone.
Question. Yes, sir. This question is directed to Mary. Mary, what is the process currently for the Cummins Foundation to select the architects that are on the list? How has that evolved over time?
A high-ranking and important member of the community said not too long ago, "You can ask me what the process is, but I'll never tell you." And that's sort of where we stand now. We believe that the integrity of the process in terms of how architects get on the list is important to remain confidential. And so the process is confidential. But it really has not, it has evolved a bit over time, but has roughly been the same process from the moment that this became an actual program, which is in the 1960s. But we try not to talk too much about it. I will say that the results have been fantastic, and that the architects on the list have been high quality and really inspirational. The other thing I would say is that the public entity who is looking at the list and given the option, if they don't like any of the architects on the list, we come up with a new list. And so we have at times had several iterations of lists from the community to choose from.
Hi, not picking on Mary, but it's for you also. Could you talk about, you talked so well, I think, about how the program has grown over time and I think built upon its successes. Could you talk about Cummins Foundation's relationship to art, or public art specifically, in the built environment?
The foundation doesn't have a specific program oriented towards art. Now, Cummins Inc., the company, certainly has invested in art for its facilities. And if you're aware of the new building being constructed in Indianapolis, which is almost done, and that's purely an effort of Cummins, the company. Certainly it has a real belief in supporting art and especially emerging artists for its own facilities. From a foundation perspective, we haven't done much of that, and not for any specific reason, but it's sort of outside of our priority areas to a certain extent. I do believe that public art can be a great enabler and a great asset to communities, and which, again, it's not to say that we wouldn't invest in it, but we don't have a specific strategy or program to invest in it.
This is for anyone on the panel who can answer. Can you talk a little bit about the extent to which ordinary people who might work at Cummins or go to schools, think about these buildings, think about the value of them? To what extent is there pushback from ordinary people about what's being constructed in their town? And I guess the secondary question would be for the archivist, is there ever an effort to think about collecting those kind of stories about how people live among these places?
I'll go ahead and start with that. So the Architectural Archives, we're located in the public library, in Cleo Rogers Memorial Library, which is an IMPay building. And so I'm going to talk a little bit about the reaction of working in one of these buildings. Also, the county said no thanks, but no thanks to the Cummins Foundation when they built the library. But the library is I love working there. I love walking in every day and wandering. I think that for a lot of staff, it's a challenging building. And it's a challenging building in part because it was completed in 1969. It has had an expansion, I'm going to say in the 1990s, I can't remember. And with the changes in technology and how people use the library, it's been hard to adapt that building to some of the new uses. So for instance, wireless technology in a masonry building, not easy. And I had a recent conversation with one of my coworkers, and she said, how can you like this building? There are no bathrooms on the ground floor. And for those of you who have been there, it's true, there are no bathrooms on the ground floor. Most of the functions, the public functions, used to be on the lower level. And when I said, well, you know, when the building opened in '69, this building actually worked very, very well for users because most users were downstairs where they had access to the bathrooms. And so here's this really mundane example, right? And as soon as I told her this, she said, I never knew that. I have to think about it because now you've made me rethink how this building's used today. And so I think that sometimes I think that we have an obligation for those of us who really feel passionate about design to to make sure that people understand, you know, how has this building changed? Why is it used in the way it is today? Because I think it's not always obvious to users. As the archivist, we continue to collect materials. We also continue to collect stories. So we have an active oral history project that's going on where we identify people in the community who have been important players in the building and maintenance of our architecture, and interview them. And that's something that we hope to continue on. And we have some of those stories from architects and landscape architects, but we really are committed to trying to not just collect the materials that document our built environment, but also the stories associated with them.
Jeff, do you think that in response to her question, in terms of how the community views some of these buildings, and if there's been pushback from the community, have you witnessed that, or any of you really, and have any thoughts about that?
Well, I don't know. I think generally the citizens of Columbus have appreciated what, and I think people understand the beauty of what they've got here. You know, in the case of our building, you know, we had problems with it like every other building, and so you would have employees there that you know would kind of grouse about it. And well, it's just, you know, it's the roof leaks, so that's typical and that kind of thing. But I mean, I think people generally appreciated it, and I think it raises people's. Again, I talked about this, but I really do. I think it raises the standard of what your expectation is in life. You know, you can walk through these beautiful buildings, and I can't talk about it other than just to say, you know, somehow it does have an impact on what can be done, you know, and what you can do, and those types of things. I know it affects our employees that way.
I'd like to go ahead and answer that also. In 1976, there was major pushback by the community and says, hey, we don't want to have these expensive architects help us anymore. And I was still at Cummins, and so I had the task of proving exactly what the facts were. And after the facts were proven, I'm sure after some other discussions by the smart people, that the BCSC decided to continue with the architectural program because it does in fact make a big difference. And I have one other story I'd like to share on Central Middle School, which was done by Ralph Johnson. We had a poor middle school, and it was in sad shape, and we weren't maintaining it, and I'm sure the children, the students thought that we didn't care much about them. We built a new one, we tore the old one down and built a new one, and amazing, ISTEP scores went up and behavior issues went down, and they seemed to enjoy the new school. So I think there is definitely a value to having some of the attributes of new schools of daylighting and better ventilation and better indoor air quality and better safety and better security does in fact help the children to feel good about themselves and do better in school. So that's my 2 cents worth.
I was wondering about, from the Cummins perspective, you guys have a great history of taking care of the buildings that you've created, and I know in Columbus there's a bit of an interesting condition where there's no official landmarks laws. So I guess in some ways that puts a lot of freedom on the owner, but also maybe some pressure too to take care of these buildings in a specific way. And I was wondering if you guys had thought about, or what the latest is on the COHA building, the Occupational Health Association, because I know that that's an important building that is kind of in limbo right now. I was wondering what you guys are thinking.
On the COHA building, and which is the occupational health building, if you've seen been on the tour or seen it, it's an interesting, very interesting building, but it is on the market, so it's up for sale. And I think that we're taking a lot of care to make sure that it gets into the right hands and that it is well maintained. The discussions have all been good, But it is a good example of a building that we own. Cummins owns it, so it's not a public building. But as a private owner of an important building, making sure, and Jeff's just been through this too, just making you can sell a building and you can sell a building. If you believe in what was just described as the role of architecture in uplifting the community, then you have a special trust, I believe, to make sure that these buildings are well taken care of and are transferred correctly. Are there imperfect situations? Absolutely. But I think that we're certainly trying to do the best we can to make sure that that building is taken care of.
Please join me in thanking our presenters.
Well, allow me to add my thanks too, and thanks again to the City of Columbus for sponsoring this event. I really enjoyed the conversation. And thanks also to Cummins, which is a founding sponsor of Exhibit Columbus and is helping us at once both make and maintain the legacy of Columbus through this new project. So thank you very much, Cummins.